So biomechanics is very much related to understanding technique of movements. And so it makes sense that we talk a little bit about movement analysis and how you go about doing a movement analysis. There's different models to follow to do a movement analysis. And when I mean models, I mean procedures, ways to think about an activity and then ultimately identifying things that are going well or things that aren't going well in order to change performance. So I'm going to go through one particular model in terms of how to approach a movement analysis. And then in another video, I'll provide some more in-depth examples of doing movement analysis. So let's start with this description of this model. So if we're going to do a biomechanical assessment of something, and again, it could be sport related, it could be ergonomics related, maybe work related. I remember I once did a ergonomic assessment of someone working at a computer station to assess injuries that the person may have been having. So in addition to coaching, there's a whole nother line of movement analysis, a line of work of movement analysis. It's not always sport related. So we'll just call this a biomechanical assessment. And one of the first things you do is you try to identify the performance goals. So what does the person want to do better at, or what are they trying to do well at? And then try to quantify that, or at least articulate it to be able to work within that scope. And I'll go through an example in just a second. Consider the influencing factors. So, in the case of the computer workstation I was assessing, I had to figure out the work environment, the chair, the desk, and so forth. So things, the computer, how big the screen was, and bright, and all that. Different things that influence the potential movement and ultimately the performance goals. And obviously, sport related comes into play too. And when you start considering influencing factor of crowd noise or field condition or environment or what have you, these are all things that could fall under this category. Then you want to start trying to understand the motions and mechanics. And really, I should have just changed this to be kinematics. To understand the kinematics, the movements involved with the motion that we're trying to assess here. So what type of flexions, extensions, rotations, phases and discrete events that you identify. And when we start using terms like phases and discrete events, phases are simply a group of movements. So if we're talking about running, we would talk about the stance phase of gait. That's the period of time where a foot is in contact with the ground. We could also talk about the swing phase of gait. That's where a period of time where the foot is swinging forward to the next ground contact. And we would look at all the movements within that phase. So the phase is a group of movements. A discrete event is a unique event that happens in a very short period of time. So I usually describe it as something that happens in a single frame of a video. So ground contact, for the example of using running, or toe off. Ground contact would indicate the beginning of a phase, and toe off would indicate the ending of a stance phase. And so phases are defined by discrete events, and discrete events ultimately define phases. But you want to try to understand those. You want to try to lay out a logical description of the movements involved with this assessment you're doing. Then, because we're taking a biomechanics approach here, determine the relevant biomechanical principles and movement techniques that may be at play here. The biomechanical principles, just think of your terminology worksheet. Anything that shows up on that worksheet could fall under this category. So we start identifying maybe some kinematic things like accelerations, or maybe we look at some kinetic parameters like ground reaction force or torque or whatever the parameter ends up being here. Then we want to do lots of observation. You want to watch the sport. You want to watch the movement. You want to watch, and even someone sitting at a desk typing at a computer if you're doing an ergonomic assessment. And sometimes that observation is just qualitative, and that you're looking for the quality of the movement and you can assess the quality of the movement, or maybe it's quantitative. You're actually going to try to measure something. We measure the ground reaction forces. We measure kinematics with video cameras or what have you. Or again, it could just be a qualitative description of a movement in terms of whether it's good or bad or what rating system you end up using. Then ultimately you take a step back and you assess the movements. You do an evaluation of the quality of the movement in general. And then ultimately you provide feedback to the user or the athlete, or maybe if you have to submit a report for ergonomics assessment. So this is just some steps to sort of operationally define how to do a biomechanical assessment. Here's just a couple of simple examples. One is springboard diving. So springboard diving, where the athlete is on the diving board and doing some aerial maneuver and diving into the pool. Maybe for a particular athlete, you're working on a performance goal of doing a forward 1 1/2 somersault in a tuck position, and you're trying to reach a score of greater than 5 out of a 10-point scale. So you state the performance goal. All right, and then what do? You identify the influencing factors. In this case, maybe some of the key ones are the springboard type. There's all different types of springboard. They taper at one end versus the other end, or double tapered board. Maybe it's a board that has waffles in the end, waffle holes, if you will, at the end, or maybe it's a solid board. Maybe the type of material the board used. But the springboard type ends up being a very important part, ultimately, to be able to determine how much spring the board is going to provide. And then the other thing is the fulcrum setting. And the fulcrum is the part of the diving board that the diver would set, either move it forward or backwards based on how much flex they want the board to have. These are just examples. It's not an exhaustive list of factors, but maybe these are some key factors in assessing the 1 1/2 somersault. Then you start looking at some of the motion, some of the kinematics. You want to look at phases. In this case, you would have an approach phase where the person starts at the middle of the board and walks to the end of the board and then ultimately leaves the board into the flight phase, doing the aerial maneuver, and then maybe you have an entry phase. And how detailed you get on these phases depends on where you're really going to try to zero your focus in. This is just a broad brush approach to describing some phases and some groups of movements that ultimately you work on. And divers work a lot on their approach. They work a lot on what happens in the air, and they work a lot on using drills for practicing how to enter the water. Then you try to identify some of the relevant and key biomechanical principles. Obviously, the force is due to the springboard. So spring in general, spring mechanics become very important to understand the stiffness of the board, how much deformation the board will have. Then you want to probably consider things like projectile motion, because once that person leaves the air, they only have the force of gravity, or excuse me, once the person leaves the board and they're in the air, they only have the force of gravity acting on them. And so you want to understand that projectile motion and ultimately how it would come back into play into doing a 1 1/2 somersault. You also, I didn't put it down here, but it goes along with moment of inertia, the resistance to change motion. Obviously a tuck, you're reducing the moment of inertia versus a pike position versus maybe a layout position. I don't know if anyone still does a 1 1/2 in layout, but you're also looking at parameters like angular momentum. These are all critical biomechanical principles. Again, I'm not putting down an exhaustive list here, but just getting an idea on how to go about this. Then you go into a lot of observation. You go watch a lot of practices, and qualitatively, you just watch with your eye. And this is what coaches do. This is what they sit there. They get trained and they train themselves in terms of what to watch for and how to ultimately the next step assess the quality of the movements. But you're trying to take in a lot of observation. And same thing with the quantitative part. You could videotape a lot of dives, and then you can watch the same dive over and over and over again. So you can get that type of observation for a particular attempt at a 1.5 somersault. And then you're ultimately going to assess, you're going to identify the strengths and weaknesses. If the person went long in the dive or short in the dive, or maybe they landed too far away from the diving board, that could influence the score of the dive, things like that. You start trying to identify what's working well, how high the person got in this case, how their entry was, and so forth. And then ultimately you provide the feedback back to the performer. And then feedback back to the performer, that's not an easy step, even though just as is here, trying, the art of taking in all this information, assessing what's going on, and then providing that feedback to the user in a way that that feedback is useful. That takes a lot of skill in amongst itself. And there could be a whole course on just trying to figure out the best way to provide feedback. Just another example, let's do cycling. So let's do a performance goal, doing a 40K cycling time trial under an hour, which is really phenomenal. Influencing factors, the bike itself, the wheels, the tires, the training that the person puts into preparing for a 40K time trial, the environment, the terrain, elevation, temperature, humidity, all these things can influence how fast you can go on the bike. I don't even have clothing on here, or gearing, or what have you. This is not an exhaustive list, but you hopefully get the idea. You start trying to identify the factors that really influence. That wheel behind me and that frame behind me are all about trying to go faster in a time trial. Motion, you start looking at the motion of especially the lower extremity as the person goes through a pedal stroke or a cycle. And you can start breaking that pedal stroke into a down phase and an up phase. And there's other phases within a pedal stroke that people would possibly identify if they want to start focusing in on maybe what's happening at the bottom of the pedal stroke, or maybe at the top of the pedal stroke, or what have you. You start identifying the relevant biomechanical principles, obviously aerodynamics. You start looking at drag force, 1/2 rho CDAV squared. Start trying to understand how to reduce resistance forces such as drag, and maybe resistance force going uphill. So you start trying to minimize the weight of all the gear. You need to understand power, how fast you can transform energy from one form to another, or the rate of work being done. And ultimately torque, because we're spinning the crank, which ultimately spins the rear wheel, and understanding the ability of a force pushing on the pedal and how that generates torque about the bottom bracket, which ultimately transfers to spinning the rear wheel. And you want to do lots of observation. Qualitative, you just want to be looking at bike handling. Is the person comfortable in aero position? Are they able to hold their head in a particular position based upon the helmet they have? But you want to watch a lot of time trial, a lot of biking in aero position for this type of, if the person's using a time trial type of bike. Some people do an Eddie Merckx style time trial where they use a standard handlebar, and that's just a different way. It's where you're not resting your arms on arm pads and trying to get an advantage of aerodynamics that way. Yeah, you can do quantitative work. You can start quantifying the bike position. You can put a person in a wind tunnel to try to figure out the clothing, the position, to minimize the drag force that's being applied to the person. And then you want to start assessing where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses. And something that you would assess is the pacing strategy. And is the person going out too fast? Are they going out too slow? Are they able to generate power, the right power going uphill? Are they able to track going downhill fast enough? There are some races that are won by time trialists that are better at going downhill than going uphill, and they just have a better skill at that. So you want to assess those weaknesses, and then ultimately communicate that important information back to the cyclist. And again, not easy to do. That takes some artwork to identify the actionable items that the cyclist can really zero in on and make some changes. So at the end of the day, what we're talking about is doing some type of biomechanical assessment or movement analysis. And it is important for physical activity specialists, biomechanists, allied health rehabilitative specialists, even physical therapists and occupational therapists to be able to do this type of skill. You're trying to do it both qualitatively and quantitatively. And the key here is for where we're going in this class is being able to identify the relevant mechanical principles that apply to the movement of interest or the phenomena occurring inside the body, even if that's where we're at. And what this class is really about is making sure that you're understanding the mechanical principles, power, torque, force, Newton's laws, what have you. And then you can use those principles to do an assessment as a physical therapist, as an occupational therapist, as an athletic trainer, as a coach, or as an athlete yourself. Okay, I hope that helps give a little bit of structure for how to do this. There will be some other videos on going through movement analysis, but I hope this helps give sort of a description of how to go about it. Thank you.